Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Lammert, the Director of Ministries and Faith Development at the UUA. This is the first, what we hope might be an annual tradition of providing a webinar on the state of the ministry. And I'm here with Don Southworth, and I'm going to ask you, Don, to introduce yourself.
I'm Don Southworth. I'm the Executive Director of the UU Ministers Association. I'm calling you from a hotel room in Denver, where I'm about to enter into 2 days of meetings talking about life cycle of ministry for continuing education and collegiality. Good to have you all today.
Great to be with you all. So welcome. I have an opening reading. I'm holding in prayer our Methodist colleagues right now who are voting right now on GLBTQ inclusion. May the spirit of inclusion be with them. And this reading is from Jane Goodall from her book, Through a Window, My 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gombe. It's called Through a Window. There are many windows through which we can look out into the world, searching for meaning. Most of us, when we ponder on the meaning of our existence, peer through but one of these windows onto the world. And even that one is often misted over by the breath of our finite humanity. We clear a tiny peephole and stare through. No wonder we are confused by the tiny fraction of a whole that we see. It is, after all, like trying to comprehend the panorama of the desert or the sea through a rolled up newspaper. And today, as we offer you some thoughts about the state of our ministry, it is as if we are offering you a glimpse through a rolled up newspaper. We can only give you our limited perspective and look for indicators of health and challenge, but there is, of course, a larger picture of ministry out there. And we welcome you into the conversation with us. We have a presentation to go through, and then we'll invite your questions and answers for a good half an hour towards the end. Don?
Sorry about that, Sarah. You were doing such a great job. I thought you were doing that over you. So this agenda tells you what we're going to be doing. We're going to begin with Sarah giving some snapshots of ministry. We thought about what are different ways we might look at through the newspaper, I guess, different lenses of what we see in ministry. Talk a little bit about the trends and challenges, and I'm not sure that any of these are things you don't know, but we'll give you our perspective on them. Some of the strategic responses the UUA and UMA are working on, and then have a chance to interact, which we hope is most of the time today. So Sarah, take it away.
Okay, here we go. So some of these statistics will be familiar to you all, and some may be new. But just to kind of give some indicators, almost like taking the temperature of ministry and the blood pressure. Since 2007, 19 million American adults have joined the ranks of the religiously unaffiliated, and this is a trend that's continuing. Interestingly, though, while we think about the millennial generation, when we think of that trend, if you look at this chart, you'll see that it's actually happening in all generations. The blue would represent the rise of those who are religiously unaffiliated. So the number in blue is 2014 and the pink is 2007. Charitable giving in the United States. In 1956, over 50% of all charitable giving went to religious groups in the United States. And now in 2014, the most recent data I could find, it's just above 30%. That's a significant drop. It could be explained in part by the rising professionalism of the fundraising profession in terms of what hospitals and universities are doing, museums, etc. But it also represents the rise of the nuns. In 1954, the choice was between congregations or religious homes. Which one will I attend? Yes, we'll make the PowerPoints available. We'll post them online for you. I see that question. But now there's all sorts of choices. There's the choice to be outside or to read a book or have some extra coffee or go to a soccer game or be catching up on Facebook on Sunday morning. And there are new forms of gathering like Soul Cycle, where you can go exercise and experience a religious cathartic experience. Or there are social media ways of organizing around religion like Pop-Up Shabbat in New York City and so many others. Those are just two examples of some of the new forms that are popping up that are now in competition with traditional congregational life. The sustainability of ministry is a multidimensional problem. We like to call those wicked problems here in Boston, but I think that's also the parlance of adaptive leadership. As you all know, escalating educational costs have led to an increasingly heavy debt load. And I think if you were all on audio, you might be gasping looking at the statistics below, where we see that last year, 83 people received seminary debt relief from the UUA, and their total debt for just those 83 people added up to $3.8 million. And we're not talking about credit cards or undergraduate debts or mortgages. We're just talking about the amount that was borrowed to pay for seminary. So that's pretty startling. Our society right now is increasingly putting the burden of education on the shoulders of students. There have been significant increases in administrative costs of running educational institutions, and that debt load has been put right on the students. So a lot of students are going to divinity school with significant undergraduate debt and continue to take on debt through their divinity school years. Last year, the average of people applying to our office for debt relief was $52,421. But the range you can see went up to $111,000. Yeah, and David, those are the 83 recipients. Thanks, Don, for answering the questions in the chat box. I'm going to go on to the next slide. And meanwhile, in congregations, there's an increased reliance on paid staff rather than volunteers, which means increasing personnel costs over time. Staff sharing can offer savings, but congregational giving has been insufficient to adequately fund all priorities, including fair and just compensation. These are statistics that represent the years 2004 to 2012. And this is membership growth or decline. I apologize that these slides are so small. This was as large as we could get them on this particular platform. But you'll see that while the Jehovah's Witnesses, Latter-day Saints, and Assemblies of God had significant growth, many of our Protestant siblings experienced significant decline, with the Presbyterians leading the way at a little over 27%. Diana Butler Bass recently wrote that these trends are slowing, but they are still continuing in the directions that you see. The UUA shows a little bit of increase, but I think we're straddling the line on the other side since 2012. And these numbers come from the Fact Finding Commission, which comes out of Hartford Seminary. This slide got a little wonky when we posted it, so the markers underneath every other column seem to have disappeared, but this represents the number of congregations and their sizes. So the middle ones, you can just figure that they represent the middle of the two sides on either side of them. So they have 372 tiny fellowship-sized congregations from 0 to 60. There are 336 that are 60 to 160 members, and so forth. But if you look at, which congregations can actually afford a full-time minister and other staff, that number gets smaller. Smaller as you get tinier. I think the wisdom is it takes at least 160 members to sustain a full-time ministry. This shows you regional growth and decline by our 5 different regions. The region experiencing the most significant growth is the southern region, while the New England region experienced almost 10% decline over the periods 2005 to 2015. And unfortunately, the RE enrollment figures are even more significantly declining. This slide is intended to show you types of ministry, and I think we made it a little too complicated to understand in this tiny print. So I will just say that 46% of our ministers serve in called settled ministries. These are types of, all different types of ministry. About, I can't even read this, 38% serve in affiliated or community ministries. And that 14%, I believe, represents interim and contract ministries. Maybe the green is interim and the brown is contract ministries. Sorry about the slide. It should have been perfected before we put it in front of you, but that was to give you some idea of the different types of ministries. These are some statistics I pulled up from the UUA's database, which represents a total of 103 ministers that are actively serving right now is what we have in our database. The average age of those ministers was 56, and average years of service 16, and you can see the gender breakdown there. 39% male, 1% identified as transgender or genderqueer, and 60% female.
So
Unfortunately, go ahead, Don.
You said 103. I thought that was 1,003.
1,003. Did I say 103? Yeah. No. Oops. Thanks you, Don. Yeah, 1,003 ministers we have in our database who are currently active in ministry. Of those roughly 1,000 ministers, though, 82% did not indicate their race or ethnicity. And we're going to have to do a survey to get better data on this. The UUA should be able to give a breakdown. So in terms of race and ethnicity, I just posted that Finding Our Way Home, which is an annual retreat for UU religious professionals of color, has grown from 33 in 2007 to nearly 100 in 2016. But I also have to say that in 2007, it was just for ministers, and now it includes seminarians and other religious professionals. So that's not a very accurate statistic. But it does show that we've had growth, and we do see some growth overall in the diversity of our ministry in this area. So this transitions data shows you the total number of congregations in the left column that started a settlement process in a given year. You can see that we had an odd bump in 2015, which many interpreted as a shortage of ministries, parish ministers. But I encourage people to wait and see what the longer trend lines are. We are seeing more people retiring for sure. The last 3 services of living tradition, we've had roughly around 60 retirees come forward, and the average prior to that was something like 30 to 35 every year. So that's a significant bump, but this year, of course, we're still in the middle of the year, so that last number of 44 won't stay that way, but it's not going to be as high as last year. And I think that's all the statistics I wanted to put before you. I don't want your eyes to cross. I see that there were some other questions on the side, and if I didn't get back to you immediately, I'll run through those later and try to follow up with an email to you. Now I'm going to turn over to you, Don, to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that you're seeing from this material.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for moving my slide too. So obviously, all this data leads you to make interpretations and speculations about the future. So Sarah and I, both in our respective positions, have to take all that data and say, okay, what's this mean, and what might it mean? So you could have a slide talk for an hour of opportunities and challenges, and oftentimes, I don't say this to be Pollyannish, but truthfully, a challenge on the other side of the coin is an opportunity. So these are just some that we see that the data tells us. Consulting and part-time opportunities are becoming more and more prevalent. Sarah's slide she showed you could see that in the number of consulting part-time ministries that are happening within congregations. We're also seeing some of that possibility for retired ministers, people who are retiring but then are finding that they want to continue to work, sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes just for continuing to have a purpose in life. They'll do consulting or part-time ministries as well. We're starting to see more and more yoke ministries, which means ministers are serving more than one congregation. When congregations are, the statistic about 160 members, obviously some congregations smaller than that do have full-time ministries, but usually it's because of endowment funds that allow them to do that. So there's more opportunity for yoke ministries. And again, these could be challenges and opportunities. There's definitely, I think this is going to be something that our other religious faiths have been doing for a while, which is going to be in the future probably newer to us, and that's more bivocational opportunities for ministry, where people may not just be being full-time ministers. Again, sometimes this is out of necessity and sometimes it's out of choice. We're definitely seeing a rise in community-based ministry. Two examples of that being chaplainship and nonprofit leadership. Right now for the UUMA, when I last looked months ago, about 24% of our active ministers have indicated in their profile with the UUMA that they are community-based ministers. So that's a big change from 5, 10, 20 years ago, especially. Obviously, Sarah touched on some of the economic challenges that are being faced not only by people preparing for the ministry, but also the people who we serve in our ministries. Ministerial debt, student debt, congregational challenges. I like to always use an example. I call it's pretty easy to say the cost of church has gone up the last 20 years because of both fair compensation, but also the cost of benefits. And in general, the numbers of people that you're getting money from flat to decline. And you don't have to have an economics degree to know that that's something that is challenging over time. So we're seeing economic challenges because of changes generationally in giving, changes, obviously more nuns mean less people in congregations. And also these challenges, economic challenges, are sometimes regionalized. I know in some of our UUMA chapters, a couple of them, we're seeing more of our ministers are doing more yoked or part-time ministries than some in other regions. So there's all kinds of economic challenges that are out there. There seems to be, especially in this era of what we call sometimes ministry after Ferguson, we're seeing more and more tensions between the pastoral and prophetic ministries. The people that ministers are serving, some are looking and yearning for the prophetic leadership about how do we change the society and culture we live in, and others sometimes withdraw during times of crisis. And so many ministers are being pulled kind of in two ways, and not just ministers, but what people are yearning for who we serve. There seems to be more and more deepening and broadening of interfaith and congregational connections. We see this in the sense that sometimes this is forced because there's fewer resources. Sometimes it's forced because of the issues that our communities are facing. But on all levels, you see more connections between congregations and also between faiths, including ours. And the opportunity and challenge for us is people are continuing to come into the ministry, at least UU ministry. Our number of people who are in formation process for the ministry is pretty much at a historical, not an all-time high, but continues to be strong. And so people are still being called to a life of service that the ministry provides them. So these are just some of the opportunities and challenges. I know some of you have recently taken part in our Where Leads Our Call. We have, that's the UUMA-wide conversations we're doing. We have a section in that to where we talk more deeply about this, and people get a chance to talk about what's most challenging and what they see as the most opportunity in. But these are just some of them. And again, most of these you could look at it from either a challenging or an opportunity perspective. So Sarah and I, with your help, is how do we respond to these? And so this is just a list of some of the strategic responses that have either been put in place or we are working on. Many of these are collaborations between the UUA and the UMA. sometimes with other religious professional groups as well. Sometimes it's a UUA initiative or a UUMA initiative. So here's just some of the things that we're working on right now or have worked on recently. The Ministerial Formation Network. Some of you may have heard that name, and some of you may not have. This is the program we've been working on in collaboration with the UUA, which is going to be how we offer everybody who's in formation for ministry discernment, support, collegiality, and training and education. So it's kind of what it looks like in a post-RSCC world, and we're going to be rolling that out in the next couple of months and piloting it next year. But it's a way for us to make sure everybody who comes into the ministry is given an opportunity for those three things, no matter where they live, no matter which seminary they go to. Fulfilling the call is something we worked on together a few years ago, and more congregations and ministers are using it. It lists kind of the duties of ministry, and people are using it for their development plans and kind of continuing education, and congregations now are using it sometimes in the search process so they can have a better sense of what ministers do and how challenging the work is. And also some congregations are using it as a tool to help with feedback and evaluation as well. The MFC is in the process right now. They just recently are changing the competencies to have kind of, I think, a more practical perspective of ministry. We at the UUMA work with the MFC. Sarah obviously is, I think, the executive of the MFC, and they're seeing more and more people preparing for ministry and going into different directions as some of the trends we mentioned. More community ministers, more folks who aren't necessarily going into parish ministry. And so the MFC is just in the early stages of the new competencies, and so that's pretty significant changes. And I was just invited to spend the day with the MFC, their last session, in part so I could see how the process works now, and also for the hope that we can continue to work together down the road. The transition process has been changing, and this is a lot of Keith's work at the Transitions Office with Sarah's support, where we're seeing more developmental ministries, we're seeing consulting ministries, we're seeing the search process going from just once a year to twice a year. And these are all things, I think, in response to the way the world's changing and congregation life's different. Continuing education, obviously from a UUMA's perspective, you know, in the last almost 7 years with our commitment to have an executive director and raise our dues, it's meant a lot more continuing education, institutes, beyond the call programs, things like that. And like I say, the meeting I'm at this week is a collaboration meeting between the UUA and UUMA about looking how we can kind of craft a life cycle of ministry, continuing education, and collegiality. Multi-faith initiatives are starting to pop up more and more. The UUA is working with some other faiths right now on innovation, where there's going to be a conference coming up. We, in our last Beyond the Call program on entrepreneurial ministry, invited both some rabbis and some UCC pastors. There's some more, like this coming GA's got a lot of multi-faith initiatives, things like Moral Monday, just a lot more things going on around multi-faith opportunities. Coaching, mentoring, and discernment support, all of that, the coaching and mentoring, we now have a formal coaching program. We have done training on mentoring, so people have more skills to be able to do that well. And the discernment support is being built into, as I say, the Ministerial Formation Network. We're definitely seeing more and more forms of collegiality. Obviously, Facebook and the UUMA colleagues is a place where people get a lot of wisdom and feedback quickly. We are now trialing video study groups at the UUMA that have been really successful. We're starting to see affinity groups come together. At the UUMA, we've had our first non-geographic chapter request, and we expect 2 or 3 more of them coming. So people, the way they gather is shifting and changing based both on technology, based on the reality that people are far away from each other, based on wanting to focus more on areas or topics that are specifically relevant to their ministries. And then quickly, just these last few is multi-site support. We're seeing a lot more multi-sites pop up. There's the UUA has folks that are working with some of these multi-site places, and we don't think it's going to stop. We think that's going to continue to grow. Faithify is one of the things that have popped up the last few years to help fund innovation away and new things that are happening. I can't keep up with all the money they're giving away. I know a couple months ago it was more than $250,000. So I think that's great news. We are the Innovation Fund. We have a program right now where we're called Wake Now Our Vision, which is a collaborative campaign between several of our institutions. And one of the things we're hoping in the next couple of months to get some, we're waiting for some donor support on that. And one of the things built into it is an innovation fund. Just compensation, we've called that for a long time fair compensation, but the UUA now is going to be, we're looking at it maybe a just compensation model, which means relooking all the tables and kind of thinking about how things are working, maybe in some new ways. Richard Nugent in Sarah's office is working on that. New, stronger collaborations. There's just a lot more people working together across disciplines, across departments, across organizations, and we think that's a really good thing. And the last thing I'll just mention from the UUMA, we've just started a good officer support team. So in addition to good officers, we now have folks who are able to work with good officers to help them when conflict comes up. And our long-term vision about good officers is that we can become much more proactive and be on the front end, not always the ones who come in after things get kind of rough. I see that my internet may be cracking me up a little bit. Hopefully it's not too bad to understand. I think the next thing is Q&A, isn't it?
Yeah, I think people can read this list of continuing education opportunities themselves. So let's turn it over to questions from people online. Seth is asking, it seems like most of the strategic responses don't really address the economic challenges. Well, it's a tough nut to crack, Seth. The success and excellence of our ministry is tied up with how well we do in terms of the economy. So it's not just about money per se. It's also about the health of our institutions, whether they're attracting new members, whether people are giving. I will say, though, that we recently held a follow-up to last year's summit on the economic sustainability of ministry. And one of the ideas that came out of that summit was to create a comprehensive OWL for money that would we could roll out over time for all ages. And that would include more training for our colleagues around fundraising, around their own financial well-being, and around things just like as basic as how to read a budget. If you're working for an institution or you're really running a small nonprofit when you are a parish minister and you're the senior parish minister in many cases. So how can we better equip our colleagues in those ways was one of the topics that came up there. Some of the things that are challenging us are well beyond our control around, how much education costs and things like that. But we will be continuing to monitor and look for opportunities and look for strategies to address that.
Yeah, and I would add I would say some of those strategic responses actually do include training, at least, on the UMA side, continuing education is huge. The work we're doing on entrepreneurial ministry is providing not just new tools for how to be much more savvy about finances, but also are exploring new ways of generating revenue. One of the things I go around everywhere is every membership organization should be looking at getting at least 10% of their income from non-members. And so the entrepreneur ministry, definitely, we've done some, not just the 2-year program, but some of our webinar sessions we've done have looked at some of the different ways to raise money, also how to be better grounded in finances. Because part of what's happening is that we have to think differently about those models of raising money, and also many of the continuing education events. The Institute always has something around fundraising, and one of the things we're working on that maybe will be part of our whole lives with money, but also maybe separate is we've been offering for a couple of years some training on legacy giving, which we find folks have not engaged in. And one of the challenges around our training our ministers is I've been working on financial and stewardship stuff for 20 years. From the first year I was in seminary, I started teaching seminarians different things around money. The truth is most of our folks don't show up when we offer these things. and that's from lots and lots of different perspectives. So we are hoping to maybe work on developing something that may be the next UUMA-wide conversation, but there's a couple things cooking up in addition to the continuing education.
I also see that Ned White asked, are there effective models of economic sustainability that are parish-based that can be the basis for congregational training? I think we've been working on lifting up effective and healthy congregations through initiatives like the Leap of Faith, where larger congregations were partnering with small congregations that wanted to grow to learn best practices. But I like your idea of looking at effective, economically sustainable parish-based examples that we could use as the basis for training. I have to say, one of the most expensive things that happens in our congregations, though, is not poor giving on the part of members. It's when there's fighting going on that dispirits everyone. So, like, for instance, when there's misconduct and the congregation blows up over a ministry, or when there are just other kinds of lay leadership misconduct, or debates and things that aren't handled in a healthy way, that can be tremendously undermining to the economic health. So those are just a couple of ways in which this is not always just about business modeling. It's also about healthy community and providing something that's inspiring, that's updating, that's creative, that calls people's spirits and calls us to our best engaged selves in community. So it's a multifaceted issue. I'm going to go on and see if there's a question below.
Just to add one quick thing. One of the things that we've heard a lot of, and partly because I also do some stewardship consulting in my spare time these days too, but it seems like we're hearing from a lot of folks like, what's the latest and greatest in raising money in congregations? It's like every few years people are looking for what's the next best thing. And one of the things that came out of the economic summit that Sarah mentioned was that we need to get better at our kind of holistic around money. Too many congregations, the only time money's brought up is when it's in the pledge campaign, and we're not talking about some of the realities of money and the spiritual connections with money. And we have to get better at that. But I don't know that there's a magic solution out there for how to raise more money. I think it's, like Sarah said, a very complex, multifaceted issue.
A plug-in for a little used resource that we have here at the UUA called the Wisdom Path, which is an excellent curriculum to use in your congregation around addressing people's relationship with money they're giving to the congregation. It's really about looking at your own, from a theological, personal, emotional stance, what your relationship with is money, and then how you use your money to source the transformation you hope for in the world. And we've had very few congregations use that. We're thinking about changing the name to something like a subtitle, Owl for Money for Adults, so that people understand what that maybe the title is deceptive, the Wisdom Path. But look for that at uua.org, and we'll include a link to that when we send out this PowerPoint after this presentation. I see Bob Rengillian is asking what changes in interim minister training might help with the strategic issues. I believe that, so I haven't ever attended an interim minister training, but I believe that the kinds of topics that are brought there do attempt to address some of these. Don, you were just at the last one, weren't you?
I was. Yeah, I mean, I was there a couple weeks ago down in Texas, and I didn't get to stay for it, but they always, one of the things that interim ministers tell me is that one of the things they love is they get really rich continuing education every year at the annual interim gathering they have. So this one last time I think was they did some work around adaptive leadership and how that applies to. They actually took adaptive leadership and were kind of doing some work with it compared with design thinking, I believe. So and design thinking, those of you may not know, is a real hot discipline. I call it a creative discipline. It's come out of Silicon Valley. We've used it in our innovation and entrepreneurial ministry program with some of the folks out at Stanford. And so I know that every year they try and have education that is varied and addresses the issues and concerns they have.
Yeah. Last year it was Deborah Popelands on After Pastor Ministry, and I believe Carrie McDonald from our outreach office was a recent presenter as well. Art Berman asks, continuing education needs to differ for parish and community ministers. There are also diversity in the types of community ministers. In your view, how can the UUMA serve these different constituencies? Don, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, Arthur, that's something that we continue to struggle with, and it's really because of what you say. Well, when we talk to our community ministers, their needs are so varied, and depending because the community ministers are so different. So we always, when we do our institute and when we do our planning for programs, we always think about community ministers. We have community ministers on our planning teams, our leadership teams, and it's tough because many community ministers they have continuing education requirements, as you well know, from whatever, like the chaplains have certain, or if you're a spiritual director, you may have certain things. But it's a tough one that we're doing another survey with our community ministers. I think it went out this week. And we talk about it a lot at center, and we look at how we can do things. One of the things that we're encouraging are these chapters to, as I mentioned earlier, chapters becoming more affinity groups, not just geography. So that it could be that we would have a chapter of community ministers, and the programming that they would have would be all focused towards community ministry. But it's a tough one. We definitely, like when we do the UUMA-wide conversations, we intend those to be for all of UU ministers. So we're sensitive and aware of that, but it's a tough one because the community ministers are so varied. For example, just a difference between a chaplain and my continuing education needs is an example. I'm an institutional community minister who's running a nonprofit. I have different community continuing education needs than someone who's a hospital chaplain. So it's tough. And we keep fighting it, but we haven't figured it all out yet. That's for sure.
I see some people made some comments that weren't questions, but they were helpful. Thanks, David Messner and Ned White. And thank you for the link, Susan. Laura Fuchs is asking, will the Ministerial Formation Network provide some training tools around economics, fundraising, and strategies for sustainable ministry models?
Wow, that would be awesome, wouldn't it? Laura, we are definitely planning to have kind of training webinars that will be ongoing for the Ministerial Formation Network. Those would be some of the topics we would cover, and so I expect we will. What many folks tell us, including me when I was in seminary, the things that you want to learn in seminary you don't appreciate till you're out of seminary for a while. But we're definitely planning on offering those types of training events for people who are still in seminary, knowing that some seminaries are providing things like that. But what we'll be offering is, we think, very practical training and education that we hope will be helpful for folks in formation.
Diane Teckert asks that multiple minister staff seem to be struggling with lack of collaboration, hierarchical structures, which reduces creativity and productivity. Is the UUA or the UUMA offering support towards more collegial relationships? Well, one exciting thing here is that our compensation director, the position is going to full-time. Jan Gartner will be taking that position after the one lovely Betsy Gabriel, unfortunately, is retiring, even though we tried to keep her forever this summer. And Jan will be coming on, and she will be doing some, not just about colleague-to-colleague structures, but how to structure staff teams in a healthy way that go beyond the ministerial staff. But I think what you're referring to here more specifically is where there are supporting ministries. We're seeing a lot this year in the air around conflict in the larger UUA, I have to say. And I do think we have some work to do more support for people who are in supporting ministries and for providing more models in that area. So I take your question. I don't think we have anything planned in that area right now, but I think Don and I are both very much aware that this is a need.
Yeah, there's a couple of things we already are working on, and Sarah and I, with Fritz Hudson right now, who's on our board, our co-chair of Center, Lynn Gardner, and Keith Cron, and Scott Taylor, we have a twice-a-year meeting where we talk about issues affecting excellence in ministry on all ends. And so it's our next meeting, I think, is next week. Excuse me, and this is definitely one of the things on our agenda. Two things that we are working on right now, we've been doing for a little bit of time. One is we've been in a partnership with Loretta and the Musicians Network. We had a task force that came back with several recommendations 3 or 4 years ago. A task force just put together a list of resources for excellence in shared ministry that we have on the UUMA website. And it's books, it's trainings, it's resources that are out there for multi staffs. And now what they're working on is the task force is working on identifying specific trainings and perhaps developing new trainings that we can offer to multiple staffs, because it's really a multiple. We know of conflict between ministers, but we also know that we've got issues around with all religious professionals on the staff. The second thing that we've done, I mentioned the Good Officer Support Team. The Good Officer Support Team has 3 specific areas of expertise they bring. One is in secession issues, where ministers leave, like retirements or interims to call, those types of things. The second is on kind of what letter of agreement issues, both creating the best one up front, but also how to end them well. And then the third is on multi-staff ministries. So we have 3 people who are experts in that. We're doing some new training at a Good Officer retreat coming up. But we're aware that we need to keep. We're highlighting covenants that but it's a multifaceted issue and problem, and we need to do more work on it, and I think we will.
Yeah, one thing that's been lifted up at the UUA level is that we don't have a good contract model for supporting ministries. We just have this one model that looks the same. So we will be taking that under advisement and seeing if we can come up with a model, even though that the situation is different in different congregations about what that means, but we'll be looking into that. Reverend Russ Mank from Santa Cruz is experiencing part-time ministry as a path forward that works for smaller congregations. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the UUMA would pursue and provide support for part-timers? And please no joke about, that there's no such thing as part-time ministry. That's an old joke, isn't it, Russ? That's a UUMA question, Don.
Yeah, I wonder what that would look like. My sense is there is some differences with continuing education for part-time, but Russ, send me some ideas, suggestions, because when we think parish ministry, we think if you're part-time or full-time, that things like preaching and finances, all that is all relevant, but there may be certain things that are particularly of interest to part-time ministers that we could offer.
Christina Solari, you moved just exactly where I was going to next, so thank you. She's interested in multi-site ministry after attending a workshop with Scott Taylor, who's the Director of Congregational Life here at the UUA, but she's finding resistance both in her congregation and in her colleagues. Is there a process the UUMA and UUA can jointly create to guide us into this? Well, I have to say multi-site is Scott Taylor's passion, and he will be creating more and more tools around this, and field staff will be offering trainings. I think multi-site has a lot of promise. For right now, we're seeing an interesting experiment, for instance, in the lower Hudson area of New York State, where there are 5 congregations that are considering sharing 3 DREs, each of whom would have a specialty area. So rather than like 2 congregations sharing someone half time and fighting over how many Sundays they get of the DRE's time, they're looking at what are the resources in their cluster and how could they best utilize those resources. And it turns out those religious educators have passions in different areas, youth ministry or younger children or whatever it may be. And so they're looking at this. It's an experiment, so we'll see how it goes. But I think that kind of creativity and staffing could provide some economic, some synchronicity, and also be really exciting for the colleagues working those teams, especially if you really get to pursue the area you're most interested in and then work with multiple congregations in that area. But if we have trouble in one congregation among a team, of course, in multiple congregations, you're going to have politics to deal with. So that'll be an area of ongoing training and discernment.
Yeah, and I'll speak to the colleagues piece. I think that the change is happening both in the religious world and in ministry so quickly that some people embrace that change and move towards, okay, where's the possibilities? and other folks kind of go back to what they know. And so, things like multi-staff and congregational collegial collaborations, to me, that's one of the most positive opportunities that are coming out of all these changes. Because the idea that we can go alone, whether it's, without speaking for a minister, if you can't go it alone, congregations really can't go it alone. And I think that we need to keep talking about that among colleagues about what are these changes, what are we afraid of with them. We're looking at things like turfs and all those things that, we can hold on to that, but I would say that we hold on to it to our own peril. And so I think we have to be both open-hearted with different colleagues as we all react to these changes differently, but we also have to be able to have conversations about what can we do better together than we can't do alone. And I think there's tons of opportunities for this that we aren't really taking advantage of.
Ned has a great question. Ned White from UUCSR, what plans are in place to disseminate wisdom from the entrepreneurial experimentation? So I assume you're talking about specifically the 2-year entrepreneurial Beyond the Call experiment to leaders in the wider UU movement. And I know you've been talking about that, Don, in that area. So why don't you tell us what the plans are?
Yeah, we just got off a meeting with the core team on that about an hour before this meeting. So it's definitely very part of the conversation. So anybody who is in the program, any student signed up that they agreed to be a coach or mentor after the program. So that's one element. We've been offering throughout the whole 2 years webinars where we've been highlighting the tools that we've been using in the program. And we've had anywhere from 6 to 20 people sign up for those. We also are working on kind of what's next and what we're going to follow up with around entrepreneurial ministry. My hunch is that there's pretty much 3 areas that we're going to focus on. One is kind of our meta goal for this whole program is how do we create a network of people who are doing innovation, both UUs and non-UUs, that can kind of count on each other to get ideas, resources, commiserate with failures, all those things. So we're working on that. We're working on what is the we're coaching, so coaching and mentoring, so that people can actually be sharing their stuff. And also, this last thing that we're looking at is what are the specific programs we might offer to help with innovation and entrepreneurial ministry. We might be doing webinar series. We may be doing boot camps for different topics. So we're as I say, an hour ago, we were talking about that very thing. So the 2-year program ends in December. But we're already starting to design what's next.
I would recommend looking at the keynote address from the follow-up to the economic summit that just happened on May 4th, excuse me. You can find the link at uua.org, and we'll include that in the follow-up to this presentation. And if Susan, if you can find that online, just go ahead and post it for me. John Gibbons. Hi, John Gibbons in Bedford, Massachusetts. You noted the tension between pastoral and prophetic ministry. Is the tension energizing or enervating? Well, yes, John, I think it's both. I think that, some of the biggest challenges that come up in our society are some of the most inspiring and energizing sometimes, even when they represent, horrific pain and difficulty and oppression in our society. When we start to address them, it can free the soul. And I think many of our colleagues are experiencing that right now through the Black Lives Matter movement. But they're also experiencing a tension then in their own congregations, as congregations are in different developmental stages in dealing with race in America. And sometimes the minister can be a little out ahead of them, and occasionally forget to look over our shoulders and make sure people are behind us. And then there's still the pastoral ministry that needs tending to, and that can pull a lot out of people. And I think if those of you who are on the UUMA Facebook page are seeing a lot of conversation about this, a lot of ministry to each other around how to, continue and steadfast in the path. And of course, May is one of the times when our parish ministers are the most exhausted. So we hold you all in prayer who are holding this tension. I want to mention that the Standing on the Side of Love campaign is running a 6-part webinar starting June 1st called Fortification. And it's not just for ministers, it's for all activists who are looking for spiritual fortification for the journey. And I've spoken with the standing on the side of campaign director Caitlin Breed about possibly offering something just for colleagues, because not always easy for us to open up in an open forum like that. So we'll be looking at possibly something like that as well. Looking for in the next question. I don't see one. So if you haven't piped in yet, this would be a good time to do that.
John, just for kind of an offbeat answer to that, but something that's my latest soapbox. So I have a soapbox, so I'm going to use it right now. And I think there is a connection between pastoral and prophetic. One of the things that I've learned in the last couple of years by serving on a board that had nothing to do with my faith tradition, the Religious News Service Board, is the power of having non-members on boards. And I've been pushing our UUMA board about this. I've talked to the moderator of the UUA, and I would encourage congregations to start thinking about this. One of the ways to perhaps keep the pastoral and prophetic is to have our leadership be represented larger than just the communities we serve. And so I'm going to be talking and writing more about this, but if we could bring more people from our communities onto our boards, whether that's the UUMA or the congregation, I think it might help with some of the changing the way we have perceptions about what we should be doing, and it might be a real ally for ministers too. So I'll be happy to talk more about that offline, but I think it's connected with this pastoral prophetic. Thanks, Nancy. That's my job, to blow people's minds. That's the best job I've had. Thank you.
All right. Well, if I don't see any more. Oh, here we go. Another question from Laura in Basel. Is the UUMA supporting the development of professional lay leaders?
Well, one of the conversations that was at the Economic Summit of Ministry was around lay ministry and kind of thinking about where that may lead. Clearly, our primary constituency of the UMA is ministers, and I think there could be possibilities as things lay out. But at this point, we're not really looking at lay professional leaders as our primary target. We actually are thinking more religious professionals before we would go to the lay leaders. But some of our programs we're also looking at how to, as I mentioned, 10% of our income needs to come from non-members. So we're looking at ways to perhaps offer some of our programming to non-members for a fee. So it's possible lay leaders can be part of that as things develop around how we support and nurture lay leaders in the future.
Yeah, that was a major topic at this Economic Summit Part 2. There is a lot of lay ministry going on out there, but it's all going on in isolated fashion. And so we're talking about creating a network for groups that are very serious about this, like the UU Society for Community Ministry, which is developing a lay community ministry training. And others like, for instance, Meadville Lombard just is rolling out a new master's program for lay leaders starting in the fall, to have all these groups be in conversation with each other about what does it mean what does lay ministry mean as opposed to ordained ministry, what roles would they play, what would be the best paths in terms of supporting formation of lay ministry, and could there possibly be a day when we have some formal way of recognizing such lay ministers that would be reciprocally recognized. So we're just seeing it happen out there, and we'd like to unleash the power of that lay ministry. What we don't want to do is create, for our parish ministers, competing centers of power within the congregation. We don't really need that. But what we do need are mature, spiritually deep leaders in our congregations who will lead alongside of us in a boundaried fashion. So I'm excited about some of the evolution in that area and to see what comes of creating a network where people really can share their best practices.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to my response is this past year, for the first time, we convened a focus group of lay leaders and talked to them about what they think of the UUMA, what we could offer the UUMA. One of the things that's come out of that is, our mission's pretty focused, nurture excellence in ministry. So this year at our GA booth, we're going to be handing out I'm not sure what we're calling it, but basically excellence in ministry kits for both lay leaders and ministers. So I'll have and ideas for how you can nurture ministry, not just ministers.
Yeah. Okay, well, we still have 5 minutes left if anyone has another question.
We've answered every single question there could be on the state of ministry in less than an hour. Wow.
Well, if seeing none, I'm going to ask Don to do his closing reading, and we'll say a formal goodbye.
My closing reading is from the hot off the presses book that I have already read and recommend highly, called Love Beyond God, written by our colleague Adam Dyer. And this is one of his meditations called First Breath. That first breath must be delicious. It must be more tantalizing, more intoxicating than any drug, fragrant like no flower will ever be, enticing like no body scent. It must be all of this and more. Yet without words or memories, how do we know? That first glorious rush of air wants us to keep breathing, wants our hearts to keep beating, wants our eyes to open and see, wants our souls to open and say yes. The first breath wants us to live all our life saying, please, God, let me live, let me breathe for just one day more until we breathe our very last.
So, dear colleagues, we hold you all in prayer. May you be well. May you be strong. May you live with ease. Don, would you like to say anything in closing?
Thank you. And I hope to see you either in person or virtually at Ministry Days.
Goodbye, everyone.